Three opposition parties, BOSA, Rise Mzansi and the Good Party, have merged to form a new political movement called Unite for Change. The announcement was made in Johannesburg earlier today, and at the same time, Action SA named Sizokuthola host Xolani Khumalo as its mayoral candidate for the Ekurhuleni municipality. For more on these and other top stories, we are joined by political analyst Musa Mdunge, international relations expert Ayesha Kajee, and local government expert Dr Harlan Cloete. Thank you so much to our guests and for joining us this evening. And you at home, please do remember that you can send us your WhatsApps on 072-110-5584, or you can give us a call on this conversation on 010-594-6010. All right, so a very good evening once again to our panelists. I think let's just begin with the latest news that have come in today's news cycle, and the most recent developments being that merger between Rise Mzansi, BOSA, as well as the Good Party to become Unite for Change. This is, of course, to contest in the 2026 local government elections. Perhaps, Musa, let's start with you. What strategic moves behind this merger do you think is reshaping the political landscape?
Thank you so much for having me, Katlego. Good evening to you, to my fellow panelists, and to the viewers. Well, this move is, quite expected, I believe, given the political environment we find ourselves in. We are now in a world where the ANC no longer dominates South African politics electorally at a 60 percentile level. And in many ways, for smaller parties, this is an opportune time by which they can not only influence who gets into power, but as well as the policy direction that that party takes. And I think in many ways, seeing these three political parties coming together speaks to not only bringing both their resources together, and as well as their ideological and strategic relationship together. But in many ways, it is to ensure that they're able to dominate next year's elections and the South African process, given the new world that we now find ourselves in.
Ayesha, Musa is saying that this is expected. Do you think it was expected for us to now start seeing the merger of such parties? We know that South Africa does have a lot of political parties, and maybe this also just help with the electorate to now just narrow down with some of those decisions.
Absolutely. I think it was to be expected. I think we'll see more mergers coming in the days ahead. We certainly do have too many parties that are built upon very, very similar manifestos or political visions. And what none of the parties seem able to do right now is really distinguish themselves with regards to how they can actually provide for such things as service delivery, water service delivery, electricity reticulation, reduction in crime, etc., which are the main things on the electorate's mind at the moment when it comes to domestic affairs.
Speaking about when it comes to domestic affairs, you're an international relations expert. Do you find that a lot of times the globe looks into South Africa at a domestic level, particularly when it comes to the formation of political parties, even at local government level?
I think certainly some of our neighbors do. Other players in the global south certainly look at what's happening in South Africa. And then, of course, those responsible for incoming investment into the country look at issues such as political and political economy stability. So it is important as we grow into our democracy, as our democracy matures, that we start showing a level of political savvy and nuance and nous that unfortunately thus far has not been a hallmark of our local domestic politics.
Dr. Harlan, how do you think the merger of these three parties could influence local government elections and just the electoral dynamics as a whole?
I think like the previous speaker said, firstly, good evening to the panelists and good evening to the viewers. The political space is crowded and local government is the bread and butter issues. For me, democracy starts at the door of the local municipality. That's where people experience the love or indifference of the state. what we've seen over the last 3-4 years is also the rise of issue-based community parties, issue-based, where people say, we know best the issues on the ground, and the issues of local economic development, that is not necessarily addressed. And so the bigger parties make a lot of noise on the macro level, but the issue really is on the ground. For me, the Good Party was as good as gone, specifically here in the Western Cape. And so I think it's a clever move by Patricia de Lille, Musima and Mani. I thought initially that you would jump into bed with Action SA. That would make sense. And now today, Lindiwe Masibuko was announced or was not announced, and her precondition was that they should merge, And so if for this to work, they will have to learn to get together and work together and have a pragmatic approach to the challenges faced by local communities.
Speaking
it's not
about
so much about ideology.
Yes.
It's about pragmatic local issues.
Speaking about those local issues, Dr. Cloete, I mean, Action SA has announced TV host Xolani Khumalo as their mayoral candidate for Ekurhuleni. Do you think this was a good move, given how much of a community base he has garnered over the years and how much he understands, particularly when it comes to fighting crime and drugs at a local level?
Look, there were other people, political parties go for personalities. A person who's popular on TV may not necessarily be popular in communities, for example. And so managing a municipality is completely different to running a television show. And so it's more complex. It's bread and butter, grassroots governance issues. And so whether the personality will translate into vote is another thing. You have to have a machine on the ground, making sure that you work street by street, making sure that the voters come out, making sure that they understand. And like the previous panelist said, it's about the nuances, changing the narrative. For people to understand, to latch on to your message, and how to differentiate yourself from the ANC or for the other political parties, or for the DA for that matter.
I mean, Ayesha, Doctor speaks about running a mayoral office is not the same as running a TV show, but we've seen on the international front people such as Arnold Schwarzenegger, who moved from being a movie star to running as governor of California. Could those parallels be compared? Could we expect that a Xolani Khumalo could possibly run Ekurhuleni in, like him saying that it's time to take Ekurhuleni back to its glory days?
Well, anything is possible. It depends on, at the end of the day, on how much his popularity as a celebrity translates to votes as a politician, and whether as a politician he will or won't be committed, if he does achieve success, whether or not he will be committed to the communities that he's promised to serve, because this is really what our politics boils down to in the end. There's a lot of political promises made, but very little actual implementation on the ground. And one of the major things that is stymieing, that is halting implementation, is the high levels of corruption we have. I spoke about the water sector. We literally have a water mafia in this country. We have a transport mafia in this country. We've recently had a former police minister die under what some would say are very questionable circumstances. So, we have allegations of corruption permeating our governance from the national level right through to the local government level, where people are saying they see water tankers offloading water onto the streets instead of taking it into communities.
All right, we certainly do have a lot of issues happening at local government level. Let's hold the conversation there for now. We're going to take a quick ad break, but we are with our panel experts just giving their take on the big stories of the week. You can also give us your voice. You can give us a call on 010-594-6010. You can also send us an SMS or a WhatsApp on 072-110-5584. See you after this. All right, welcome back. We are talking about the top stories of this week. We are joined by political analyst Musa Mdunge, international relations expert Ayesha Kajee, and local government expert Dr Harlan Cloete. You can also give us your thoughts tonight. We do have some WhatsApps. This one is Lieutenant Mashaba from Protea Glen saying, good evening. I wholeheartedly support the South African government's decision to send investigators to collaborate with French authorities. I urge the public to refrain from making unfounded accusations that imply Nathi Mthethwa was evading the Madlanga Commission. Such speculation can cause undue distress to his family, friends, and fellow comrades. All right, and this one is from Mashisa. It says, this week's stories, Malema's firearm case and the death of Nathi Mthethwa. So those are your WhatsApps. I believe we do also have a caller on the line, Mulantwa from Kempton Park. A very good evening to you. What are your thoughts today?
Hi, good evening. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. And how are you, Mulantwa?
Yes, man. I just want to make some few contributions in relation to the voting bloc of BOSA, Good Hope, and Rise Mzansi.
Right.
You know, my sister, we respect the Constitution.
We're listening.
I'm here.
Yes,
yeah.
we're listening. To
no, I'm a South African who understand that no, in terms of the Constitution, everyone has the right to form a political party and etc. But for me, it doesn't make sense because if you make analysis, I know for the fact that Rise Mzansi, the funders are the Oppenheimer families. Because these parties that are emerging, there's nothing to offer to the black South African majority who are still having the scars of the apartheid. They're just there, sponsored by the white monopoly and the big industry to divide the vote of the black people. So it does not going to make any sense at all.
All right. Thank you so much, Mulantwa, for your thoughts. In fact, let's bring our panelists in there. Dr. Cloete, I mean, Mulantwa was saying that these parties don't serve the black communities in South Africa. They don't make sense, and they are sponsored by white capital monopoly. What's your take on that?
Look, if you look at the challenges of South Africa, the World Bank 2 years ago said South Africa is the world leader when it comes to inequality. So what is very clear is if you look at our policy choices over the last couple of years, that we have failed the poor in terms of our policies. Poverty, unemployment, and inequality. We are the world champions at that. And so what is desperately needed is a reset. It's a reset in terms of our priorities. If you look at the Madlanga Commission, what is coming out, it looks like, sometimes it feels like a movie, you know, in terms of the horror stories. And at the same time, we are failing the poor. If you look at our levels of corruption, that is what is known. And if it was not for good investigative journalists, you know, what are the other stories that are not known? So in broad, I would say, if we review the 30 years and even government's own review of the 30 years of democracy, we have failed the majority of the people in this country.
Musa, I mean, speaking to my colleague Xoli Mgambi a little earlier on, the three leaders of these political parties were just explaining the trajectory that they're looking to take with the 2026 local government elections. And they speak to those same issues that Dr. Cloete is speaking about in terms of the failures that we are seeing across the board in the country, particularly when it comes to service delivery at local government level.
Certainly, Katlego, you know, this particular matter is quite important here because we keep having this conversation about how do we grow the South African economy? How do we ensure that, you know, South Africa is a competitive economy that is able to challenge other countries in the attraction of investment? And in many ways, we've got to think about how do our cities operate? And so the fact that these parties are collaborating at this point is a very good thing. But I think one element that perhaps is missing is the cross-pollination and relations between cities. There's not much of a discussion around that. How do we ensure that getting from Pretoria to Johannesburg to Vaal is far easier to ensure that the cost of doing business goes down, for example? So there are many things here that there are many opportunities here that are presented for these parties in terms of what they can really present to the South African populace, but they've got to have an effective communication plan. And I think that's going to be very key if they're going to build the kind of confidence required to break the hold that the big sort of political parties have over the South African political space.
Right. So one of the big stories this week is, of course, the unexpected death of South African Ambassador Nathi Mthethwa. This took place in France on Tuesday. He reportedly fell from the 22nd floor of the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Paris. Ayesha, our viewer that was sent us a WhatsApp from Protea Glen spoke about speculation and saying that it's a good thing that the South African Police Service has sent those investigators to France to assist in those investigations. What's your take from an international relations point of view with this step taken by the police minister?
I think it's a good thing. I welcome it. I think it's important that South Africans be present in France and actively involved into the investigation into Ambassador Mthethwa's death. I do think that the timing of this particular death was questionable. There still exists quite a lot of questions and controversies, and lots of speculation, of course, around the cause of death and whose responsibility it was, etc. So I think it's a good thing that, members of the South African Police Services and associated departments in the criminal justice system should be present in France and should be actively involved in the investigation. I also would like to address the fact that particular commentator said, don't speculate. Well, it's human nature to speculate, isn't it? And it does bring to mind another very questionable death that happened in Paris several decades ago, that of Dulcie September, which was never adequately investigated or addressed. And it brings back some of the same questions about the deep state and about not only the deep state in South Africa, but the cooperation between criminal groups and inter, or extra national corruption, if you will, and syndicates internationally, etc. And I think it's important that we have these conversations in the public arena, because as Dr. Cloete has pointed out, some of the findings coming out of the current Madlanga Commission are indeed shocking, and they should be of concern to every South African, every tax-paying South African, given that, the huge amount of apparent political maneuvering, to say the least, and corruption, really high-level corruption within the police services, serves nobody except a few elite members of government and perhaps the private sector, but really is not in the best interests of the South African citizen.
Well, let's hear from those South African citizens. We've got Peter in Brits. Peter, a very good evening to you. What do you have to say to us today?
Thank you, ma'am. I really appreciate it. I'm worried about those politicians, especially those that have voice, but they don't talk on the interest of the people. Like the issue of Madlanga Commission is the issue that politicians, most of politicians, they're supposed to be rallying behind it, supporting it. If you check past years, there was a movement called COSATU that was behind the working class. Every time when we have things like this, they will go on the street and support. Like Patricia Dilele, they are talking about opening another political party. Like now in my rural area of Tete, I don't have electricity for 12 months. But we have a politician that are taking a lot of things, promising us a lot of things. There was a presidential hotline in the era of President Zuma, the former President Zuma. There was a presidential hotline that was sponsored by taxpayers' money. That presidential hotline didn't do anything for us, the poor. We did submitted a lot of complaints, but there was no outcome. There was another commission, there's no outcome. Taxpayers' money is going nowhere. Even now we have Madlanga Commission. If tomorrow we don't see fruits of those commissions, it's a waste. No one is accounting for that.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for your thoughts. It certainly is quite concerning in terms of what our communities are going through and the lack of that service delivery. We also have Jacob from Mankweng. Jacob, a very good evening to you. What are your thoughts tonight?
Thank you very much for having me. Look, my take is that I see this measure as a total waste of time. It's precisely because, hello?
Right. Yes, we can hear you, Jacob.
Yeah, because I strongly believe that this is just a desperate three individuals who actually failed to make an inroads in the political space. Especially, BOSA had an opportunity to merge with Action SA when the ANC was actually showing signs of weakness. And at that time, South Africans wanted an alternative. But because of their egoistic kind of a posture, they failed dismally to compromise in the interest of the people. Now, when they realize that, no, the ships are down, then they come up with another, a makeshift kind of a structure just to deceive South Africans. And we know that most of the South Africans are so gullible, they are just actually voting astray. And then I strongly believe that those three, the three initiative and the measure itself, is nothing but just a makeshift that is not going to offer South Africans anything. But as black people, we must actually pause and calibrate something that will be able to take us forward. But from where I'm seated, I don't know exactly what is it that we can do just to ensure that indeed we come up with an alternative. But the measure itself is not going to offer anything for South Africans.
All right. Thank you so much, Jacob. We do have some of your WhatsApps at this point in time. Mampulu says, Natim Teto's sudden death is what stood out for her. And then Nameng Matluku says, Kolani must be careful because community is going to do the same thing he was doing when tracing drug dealers. This is, of course, in relation to Kolani Khumalo, who has now been announced as the mayoral candidate for Action SA's in the municipality of Ekurhuleni. Well, we're going to continue after the break with our panelists, so do stay with us. Welcome back. We are looking at the top stories of the week with our political analyst Musa Mdunge, international relations expert Ayesha Kajee, and local government expert Dr Harlan Cloete. So one of the top stories once again this week was that interception by Israel of the flotilla that was taking aid to Gaza. Musa, I mean, this is certainly of great concern. 450 activists that have been detained. We did hear from Durko that many of them are in good health. But what does this incident reveal about our position as a country on the international front with regards to conflict and our diplomatic stance?
Well, look, certainly this particular issue is perhaps for South Africa a potential high point in its diplomatic efforts to really bring to global attention Israeli actions as it pertains to its war in Gaza, particularly when we look at the response to humanitarian aid and the blockade that the Israeli government has done in that particular area. And in many ways, this highlights the international law that the Israeli government has been arguing that it is so much the protector of. And in many ways, it is a challenge to the United States, a challenge to European allies of Israel to really challenge the country in terms of its action. But it's also time for South Africa to broaden in terms of its strategy, in terms of looking at how does it get the rest of the African continent, the rest of the global south, speaking in one voice in terms of what's happening in that country.
Ayesha, I mean, we've been hearing that Israel had no jurisdiction to detain these activists. What does this say to us just about Israel's continued actions, whether it's the continuance of bombing Gaza or the detaining of activists and blocking of aid?
Well, the flotilla was between 60 and 100 nautical miles from the coast of Gaza in international waters, which means that Israel's actions are unlawful, and that the boarding of the flotilla ships and boats can be regarded as piracy in international terms, and that the arrest or detaining of the crews of these boats can be regarded as kidnapping, quite frankly. And I believe that this is the way that South Africa and the countries that the other activists belong to should be viewing this as an act of piracy, as an act of kidnapping, and as illegal, blatantly illegal under international law. However, we've seen over the last 2 years, let alone the last 70 odd, over the last 2 years, we've seen Israel flagrantly disregard international law with impunity, up to the extent of disregarding direct imperatives from the World Court, the International Court of Justice, with regard to its actions in Gaza. We've also seen in recent days Israel's foreign minister call the flotilla terrorists when Israel's own actions can be deemed terrorist in the context of the illegality of those actions. So I do believe that South Africa's stance has been a moral one. It's been a human rights one. I don't think any other country in the world would have dared detain the grandson of Nelson Mandela as part of a flotilla like this, and to call him a terrorist. But then, of course, his grandfather proudly wore that label terrorist when it was, given to him by countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom before, the tide turned against apartheid South Africa. So it's almost history repeating itself in many respects.
Right.
I do hope, as I'm sure many do, that the activists, the South African activists, particularly my sister Zuki Swawana and my extended family member Riaz Mullah, that they're all in good health, that they're unharmed, and that we'll see them home soon. And I do believe our government should be working very urgently to secure their rights.
Do you think government is doing enough to ensure their safety and their return back home?
I think government is doing everything they can right now without, shall we say, causing more upsets in the international diplomatic arena. But perhaps what is needed is to actually cause an upset.
Yeah.
That one or other governments, or perhaps a group of governments, need to actually cause that upset. Because really, for a country to behave with the kind of impunity that the IOF and Israel have been doing, it's really unacceptable. And you know what they say, that, you keep silent when they come for those who are not you.
Right.
And the next thing you know is you're going to be the one that they come for. So if Israel can behave this way towards members of this flotilla, its allies, both in the Middle East and in the North and elsewhere in the world, should be sleeping very ill at ease. Because if they can do this with impunity towards Gaza, the Palestinians, and now the flotilla activists, don't think that impunity of theirs will not extend to you.
Right. Dr. Cloete, Ayesha speaks of upsetting some of those international players with some of these events. Do you think that this particular incident could further dampen the relations between South Africa and the USA?
Look, South Africa must be commended for its consistent stance on this to the crisis in the Middle East by taking the route of the ICJ, International Court of Justice. It has drawn a line in the sand, and it has repeatedly said that it will not be intimidated. Given our recent history of humanitarian violations, I think South African stance there should be commended. And South Africa is not alone. We have the rest of the world waking up to this humanitarian crisis. And I think all of us, want peace and saying, there's human suffering. Where there's human suffering, no matter what religion, where there's human suffering, people need to speak out and to say what is wrong, that you can't condone actions like that, And so South Africa has repeatedly said that it is not a proxy of the United States and that it will take a principled stance given our most recent history.
Another top story of this week was that of Magistrate Toinette Olivier handing down that verdict on Wednesday on the EFF leaders with regards to firing that firearm in a public space. Musa, I mean, this sentence, or rather this verdict, could attract a sentence of up to 15 years imprisonment. Of course, we'll only hear about that on the 26th of January. Could this lead to internal turmoil within the party and seeing more contest amongst members?
Well, look, I mean, given the fact that the EFF does not have a step-aside rule in the same way that the ANC does, it is possible, of course, that Malema will continue to serve as the leader, even if he may not be its leader in parliament. Now, the question is, who fills that gap? Should there be a need for him to then step down as a member of parliament, given the fact that, you know, two key sort of faces and allies in the face of Dr. Ndlozi as well as Shivambu no longer serve in the top echelons of the party. And so in many ways, the EFF finds itself at a crossroad, but I think this is an opportunity because in many ways, there's been questions about what does EFF look like beyond Julius Malema? Is this an organization that can truly stand, or is it simply based on the politics of personality? And if that personality no longer occupies central stage, almost in the same way that we could argue that the MK party has the same challenge. After Jacob Zuma, then what? And I think that that's the question that the EFF have got to answer. It is an opportunity for not only the EFF, but for others who occupy the left in terms of South African politics, where I think the ANC has tried to straddle this centrist position not so well. There is a gap in terms of the left of our politics. And if Malema is not that guy, the question is who then becomes that person.
Dr. Cloete, do you think the party should prepare for a future without Malema?
Look, it's there's a long process before we get there. I think Julius will not take this lying down. He will use the courts or whatever avenues to make sure that he survives this. I think what is interesting about this case is that it was pursued by AfriForum. Whereas our prosecuting authorities didn't do anything, AfriForum, which is a civil society organization, relentlessly pursued this. And today they announced that they're also coming for the Secretary General of the ANC related to the holiday in Dubai a couple of years back. And the allegation that that bill was footed by private sector to the tune of holiday in Dubai, 681,000, I think, something like that. And so it shows the role of civil society and organizations like AfriForum to influence this body politic because, you know, we've always said, you know, I think the mistake of 94 was before 94, there was a very active civil society. Post 94, we almost got and sat on our hands and said, you know, you solve our problems. And our system of participatory democracy demands that citizens are active in the shaping of society. And certainly they have the resources. Yes, organizations like the Solidarity Movement and AfriForum are causing these things to come to light, to their credit, you know. And so it's going to be an interesting ride, even with this commission, the Manlang Commission, what happens with that, because we are very good at commissions, but we're very bad at making sure that the recommendations of these commissions are acted upon. And that is a problem as well.
It certainly is. I see you nodding there, Ayesha, especially when it comes to active citizenry and ensuring that we're not taken over by the Messiah effect, but for civil society to stand up and to see accountability, especially amongst those that lead us.
Absolutely, but I do think that Dr. Cloete is right that there was a bit of a vacuum after 1994. That vacuum was largely caused by many of our then existing civil society organizations being, shall we say, culled by government. Many people who were active in civil society went into government and then from government into the private sector or directly into the private sector, unfortunately. So there was a bit of a vacuum in civil society, in the civil society spaces, and that does need to be filled. What is encouraging is that we are seeing a resurgence of civil society movements, particularly grassroots ones. And that's where it's important. I'd like to also just bring in, some of the comments your viewers made earlier. The key things that stood out for me in the comments made thus far are that, people want to see service delivery versus endless cosmetic plugs or plastering of a problem, whether that plaster is a commission of inquiry, some of which do very good work, but whose recommendations are rarely implemented and so really trickle down to the citizen level, or whether those plasters are in the form of a whistleblowers or a crime helpline or a service delivery hotline or whatever it is.
Right.
When those are never, again, actually implemented. So that was a key thing that came out from several of your callers. The other one that I found quite interesting was the issue of political party funding, which we don't have a great deal of transparency around. And the caller actually mentioned, or I don't know whether it was a WhatsApp, no, I think it was a caller, mentioned that much of the funding comes from what he called white monopoly capital. And perhaps we need to look at why that is so. Is that why then so many of the parties, three of whom are merging now, have very similar visions and appear to be much of a muchness, much of the sameness? Is it because they're being funded by the same funders? And what can we do to diversify that funding base? What can we do to make it more transparent so that voters actually know who funds the people that they're voting for?
Of course. Well, that's all the time we have for. Thank you so much to our panelists this evening for your very valuable contributions with the top stories of the week. Musa Mdunge, Ayesha Kajee, as well as Dr Harlan Cloete. Thank you so much for your time. All right, and that's how we wrap up this hour. Your headlines are up next after this.